Before we begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that expose the truth behind real crimes.
It began like many routine police calls do, quietly, without warning, and with no hint of the darkness waiting just beneath the surface. Officers responding that day believed they were stepping into a normal situation, something they had seen dozens of times before, but within hours they would realize they were standing at the edge of a secret so disturbing that it would change every assumption they had made. This story centers on a woman whose life appeared ordinary on the outside, and the investigation connected to Robert Poynter, a case that would slowly unfold into something far more unsettling than anyone expected. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Neighbors described a calm area, the kind of place where people waved politely and kept to themselves. The woman at the center of this case blended in easily. She had routines, responsibilities, and a life that did not raise immediate concern. To most people, she was simply another face in the community. But true crime often hides in plain sight. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a dramatic event. It came from inconsistencies, small details that did not fully make sense when placed together, a report that did not line up, a statement that felt rehearsed, a timeline that left quiet gaps. These are the moments investigators are trained to notice, even when others might dismiss them. When officers began asking questions, the woman cooperated. Her tone was calm, her answers were measured. She did not appear nervous, and she did not resist. On the surface, she seemed almost relieved to talk, but experienced investigators know that calm does not always mean innocence. Sometimes it means preparation. As police dug deeper, they discovered connections leading back to Robert Poynter. At first, his name appeared only on the edges of the case. A contact, a past interaction, a loose thread. But loose threads, when pulled carefully, can unravel entire stories. Records showed repeated contact between them, phone calls, messages, patterns that suggested a relationship more complex than what had initially been described. When questioned about this, the woman downplayed its importance. She framed it as casual, unimportant, nothing that deserved attention. But investigators did not agree. They began reconstructing timelines. Where had she been? When? Who could confirm it? These questions are the backbone of any serious investigation, and as the answers came in, cracks started to form. Witness statements conflicted. Digital records told a slightly different story than spoken words. Slowly, the picture shifted. What officers were uncovering was not just a misunderstanding, but a carefully hidden truth, one that involved choices, awareness, and actions that could not be easily explained away. The more they learned, the clearer it became that this was not a simple case of coincidence or bad judgment. Behind closed doors, investigators discussed the growing concern. There was a sense that they were only seeing the surface of something much larger. Experience told them that when stories begin to fall apart in small ways, it often means something significant is being concealed. Robert Poynter's role in this story became increasingly important. His past, his behavior, and his connection to the woman raised questions that demanded answers. Authorities began reviewing his background more closely, looking for patterns that might explain what they were seeing now. At this stage, no accusations were made publicly. Law enforcement moved carefully. In cases like this, rushing can compromise everything. Evidence must be gathered properly. Facts must be verified. Assumptions have no place here. The woman continued to maintain her version of events. She insisted there was nothing more to uncover, but investigators could feel it, the sense that they were standing on the edge of a truth that had been buried deliberately. And this is often how horrifying secrets are discovered, not through a single shocking moment, but through patient work, through listening, through noticing what does not quite fit. By the end of that initial phase, one thing was clear. This case was no longer routine. Whatever had been hidden for so long was beginning to surface, and once the truth starts coming out, there is no way to stop it. As investigators moved deeper into the case, the calm surface surrounding the woman's story began to crack in more obvious ways. What once felt like minor inconsistencies now looked like deliberate gaps, the kind that appear when someone knows more than they are willing to admit. Officers understood that this was the stage where patience mattered most. Push too hard and people shut down. Move too slowly and the truth can slip away. They started by re-examining everything connected to Robert Poynter. His name was no longer just a side detail. It was becoming central. Records showed that his connection to the woman was not recent or casual. It went back further than she had claimed, much further. There were patterns of contact that suggested planning, not coincidence. When confronted with this information, the woman's tone shifted slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for trained investigators. She became more careful with her words. Her answers grew longer, more detailed, as if she were trying to fill space before anyone could ask the next question. This often happens when someone is trying to stay ahead of the truth. Police then began speaking to people in her circle. Friends, neighbors, anyone who might have noticed changes in behavior. What they heard was not dramatic, but it was telling. Several people mentioned mood swings, periods of stress, moments where she seemed distracted or emotionally distant. On their own, these details meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern. Digital evidence played a key role at this stage. Phone data, location history, and message timestamps provided something stories could not change. They showed meetings that had not been mentioned, late-night contact that had been minimized, moments where the woman's physical location did not match what she had told officers. Each new discovery tightened the case. Investigators began to suspect that the horrifying secret was not a single act, but a series of decisions made over time. Choices that started small and grew heavier with each step. This is often how people get trapped inside their own lies. Once the first line is crossed, it becomes harder to turn back. Robert Poynter's background raised further concerns. Authorities uncovered troubling behavior from his past that made his involvement far more serious than initially assumed. While details were kept confidential during the investigation, it was clear that his history did not align with the harmless picture the woman had tried to paint. The question investigators now faced was simple but disturbing. How much did she really know? Was she manipulated or was she aware? Was she afraid or was she protecting something? These are difficult questions and the answers are rarely clean, but the law requires clarity, not sympathy. When police brought the woman back in for another interview, the atmosphere was different. This was no longer a casual conversation. It was focused, structured, direct. Investigators laid out facts one by one, watching closely for reactions. Silence can speak louder than words in moments like these. She denied wrongdoing, but her explanations began to contradict earlier statements. Timelines shifted. Details changed, and each change made the story weaker, not stronger. At this point, officers knew they were closing in on the truth. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were already being briefed. The case was moving beyond investigation and toward accountability. Decisions made in these moments would shape everything that followed. What made this case especially disturbing was the realization that the secret had been hidden in plain sight. Not through force or chaos, but through routine, normal days, ordinary conversations. This is what unsettles people the most. The idea that something so dark can exist alongside everyday life without being noticed. By the end of this phase, investigators were confident of one thing: the woman's story was no longer credible, and Robert Poynter's role was far more serious than anyone had imagined at the start. The turning point in this case did not come from a single confession or dramatic moment. It came from pressure, steady, factual, and unavoidable. By now, investigators had enough information to know that the truth was being deliberately held back. What they needed was the moment when the story could no longer survive against the evidence. That moment arrived when police completed a full comparison between the woman's statements and the digital record of her actions. Time and again, the data contradicted her words. Locations overlapped where she claimed distance. Communications appeared where she claimed silence. These were not mistakes, they were choices. When investigators presented this information, they did not accuse. They asked simple questions, calm ones, the kind that leave no room for escape. And with each answer, the woman's version of events grew more strained. She began to explain instead of respond, to justify instead of clarify. That shift mattered. Attention then returned fully to Robert Poynter. His actions, movements, and past behavior were examined alongside hers. What emerged was a pattern of coordination, not constant but deliberate, enough to show awareness, enough to suggest intent. This is where the case took its most disturbing turn. Investigators began to realize that the horrifying secret was not something discovered after the fact. It was something known and concealed. The woman had not simply been near wrongdoing. She had taken steps to hide it, to delay discovery, to protect someone she knew was dangerous. When questioned about this directly, her response changed again. This time there was hesitation, long pauses, moments where words failed entirely. Fear entered her expression, but it was unclear what kind: fear of consequences or fear of exposure. Police understand this moment well. It is the point where someone must choose between truth and self-preservation. As interviews continued, fragments of the real story began to emerge, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough to confirm what investigators had suspected. The woman had knowledge of actions tied to Robert Poynter that went far beyond what she had admitted. She had helped maintain a false image. She had kept quiet when speaking up could have mattered. The weight of that realization shifted the entire case. Prosecutors now saw a path forward, not just against Robert Poynter, but against the silence that allowed harm to remain hidden. Evidence was organized, charges were considered carefully, every step was taken with caution, knowing that the case would face intense scrutiny. Publicly, little was said at first. Authorities chose restraint, but internally there was no longer doubt. The horrifying secret had been identified, and it was no longer protected by uncertainty. What makes this part of the story so unsettling is how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. The woman continued daily routines, conversations continued, life appeared normal. Yet beneath that surface, the truth had already caught up. Investigators often say that lies collapse under their own weight. This case was proof of that. The effort required to keep the secret hidden had become too large, too complex, too fragile. One more question, one more record, and it all fell apart. When the woman was finally confronted with the full scope of the evidence, the silence that followed said more than any denial ever could. The moment was not dramatic. It was heavy, the kind of silence that marks the end of pretending. From that point forward, the case moved quickly, legal steps were taken, protective measures were considered, and the focus shifted toward ensuring that the full truth would be brought forward, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Once the truth began to surface, there was no turning back. The investigation entered a new phase, one where accountability replaced uncertainty. What had once been a quiet, careful inquiry now became a firm push toward answers that could stand up in court. Investigators knew that uncovering a horrifying secret was only part of the job. Proving it clearly and responsibly was the real challenge. Authorities began formalizing the case against Robert Poynter while also examining the woman's role with sharper focus. This was no longer about what she claimed not to know. It was about what she did know, when she knew it, and what she chose to do with that knowledge. Those questions mattered deeply, both legally and morally. As evidence was reviewed again, piece by piece, it painted a troubling picture. Communications showed moments where warnings could have been raised. Actions showed opportunities where intervention was possible. Instead, silence was chosen. Investigators do not take such conclusions lightly. Every assumption had to be backed by fact, every inference supported by proof. During this period, interviews continued, but they changed in tone. The woman was no longer being asked open-ended questions. She was being asked to explain specific facts, dates, messages, movements. Each question narrowed the space where denial could exist. Each answer either aligned with the evidence or did not. And more often than not, it did not. This created a psychological shift. The woman began to realize that the version of events she had relied on could no longer protect her. What once felt like control now felt like exposure. This is a common moment in serious investigations, the realization that the truth has already moved ahead and the person trying to hide it is falling behind. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared carefully. Cases involving hidden knowledge and silence are complex. They require jurors to understand intent, responsibility, and consequence without relying on emotion alone. The focus remained on facts, patterns, and choices. Robert Poynter's role continued to draw attention. His behavior, both past and present, reinforced concerns investigators had raised early on. The connection between him and the woman was now clearly defined, not as incidental, but as meaningful. This connection mattered because it showed awareness, and awareness changes everything. As legal steps moved forward, authorities also considered the broader impact. Cases like this are not just about punishment, they are about prevention, about sending a clear message that knowingly hiding dangerous truths has consequences. Silence, when it protects harm, becomes part of the harm itself. Public reaction began to grow as details emerged. People struggled to understand how something so serious could remain hidden for so long. But investigators knew the answer well. Secrets survive because they are protected by routine, trust, and fear. This case reflected that reality in an unsettling way. For the woman, the pressure became constant. Every statement was weighed, every decision scrutinized. The life she had once known no longer existed. What replaced it was uncertainty about outcomes, about judgment, about how the truth would be received. Yet even in this moment, investigators noted something important. The case was not driven by revenge or outrage. It was driven by responsibility. The goal was clarity, accountability, and above all, ensuring that no further harm could be hidden behind silence. As the case edged closer to formal charges and courtroom proceedings, one thing became clear: the horrifying secret was no longer just a secret. It was now a documented reality, backed by evidence and witnessed by the law. As the case entered the courtroom phase, everything slowed down, but the pressure increased. This was no longer an investigation happening behind closed doors. Now, every detail mattered, and every choice made in the past was about to be examined in public. The horrifying secret that had been hidden for so long was finally being placed under a legal microscope. Prosecutors built their case carefully. They did not rely on shock or emotion. Instead, they focused on patterns. They showed how the woman's actions, taken together over time, revealed awareness rather than ignorance. One message alone meant little. One meeting could be explained away. But dozens of moments, aligned in sequence, told a story that was hard to deny. The courtroom heard how opportunities to speak up were missed again and again, how silence was maintained even when warning signs became clear. Prosecutors emphasized that this was not about making a mistake once, it was about repeated decisions to look away. That distinction was critical. The defense, on the other hand, leaned heavily on fear and manipulation. They argued that the woman had been influenced, controlled, or intimidated by Robert Poynter, that she had acted out of confusion rather than intent. These arguments were presented calmly, aiming to introduce doubt without directly challenging the evidence. But doubt only works when facts are unclear, and in this case, many facts were firmly established. Digital records were especially powerful. Unlike memory, they do not forget. Unlike stories, they do not change. Messages, timestamps, and location data showed a consistency that human explanations could not undo. The woman's own words, recorded over time, contradicted her later claims. As testimony continued, it became clear that the jury was paying close attention to one key question: did she know enough to act, and did she choose not to? That question hung over every witness, every document, every argument. Robert Poynter's involvement remained central. His actions and history were laid out in a way that showed why silence mattered so much. Prosecutors did not need to exaggerate. The facts spoke clearly on their own. The connection between him and the woman was no longer ambiguous. It was defined, sustained, and purposeful. Throughout the proceedings, the woman's demeanor changed. Gone was the confidence of earlier interviews. In its place was restraint, stillness, the realization that the narrative was no longer hers to control. In court, there is no room for rewriting the past. Observers noted how quiet the room became during key moments. This was not a dramatic trial filled with outbursts. It was unsettling in a different way. Calm, methodical, and heavy. The kind of atmosphere that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. As arguments came to a close, the weight of the case was undeniable. This was not just about one horrifying secret, it was about responsibility, about the cost of silence, and about how ordinary choices can carry extraordinary consequences. When the jury was sent to deliberate, there was no sense of relief, only waiting for a decision that would define how the law views silence when it protects harm. When the jury returned, the courtroom felt heavier than it had at any other moment in the case. This was the point where everything, the lies, the silence, the choices, would be judged. The horrifying secret that had once been carefully hidden was now fully exposed, and the outcome would determine what accountability truly looked like. The verdict reflected what the evidence had shown all along. The jury concluded that the woman's actions were not the result of simple ignorance or fear alone. They recognized a pattern of awareness and deliberate silence. A silence that allowed harm to remain hidden when it should have been brought into the light. The decision was firm, and it carried serious consequences. Robert Poynter's role was also addressed clearly. His actions, history, and behavior confirmed why investigators had been concerned from the beginning. The case against him left little room for doubt. What mattered most was that the truth had finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or minimized. For the woman, the verdict marked the end of denial and the beginning of consequence. There was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, just stillness, the kind that comes when a person realizes there are no more versions of the story left to tell. The reality had settled in, and it was permanent. In the weeks that followed, the case faded from headlines, but its impact did not fade for those involved. Families were left to process what had happened. Communities questioned how something so serious could have stayed hidden for so long, and investigators reflected on the importance of persistence and attention to detail. Authorities later spoke about the lessons learned. This case was not just about uncovering a crime, it was about understanding how secrets survive, through trust, routine, and the belief that staying silent is safer than speaking up. In reality, silence often causes the most damage. The story also highlighted something uncomfortable but important. Ordinary people can become part of something terrible without committing the original act. When someone knows the truth and chooses to protect it, they become connected to the harm that follows. This case made that clear. For the public, the case served as a reminder to trust instincts and question what does not feel right. Many horrifying secrets are not hidden behind locked doors. They exist in everyday spaces, protected by familiarity and fear of consequences. In the end, justice was not about revenge. It was about responsibility, about drawing a clear line between ignorance and choice, and about showing that the truth, no matter how carefully buried, will eventually surface. This case leaves behind a simple but powerful lesson. Knowing the truth carries responsibility, and when silence protects harm, it becomes part of the crime. Because sometimes the most horrifying secrets are not just what people do, but what others choose not to say.